Hey, folks, thanks for tuning into the Banff Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lafferty. And here, gracing our little dog and pony show with the patina of respectability is Mr. Dan Abnett, respected British writer of comic books, real books, and just all kinds of great stuff. Dan, such a pleasure to have you, sir.
Very nice to be here again, actually, and real books like that, saving that one.
You're making me feel bad for my informal American banter. Sci-fi author Richard Fox is here co-hosting today. Good to see you, Richard.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And frequent co-host who's been MIA for a long time, Walt, because he's been actually joined the writer game himself. Walt Rebelliard, good to see you, sir.
I have no patina of respectability.
I only have it when Dan is here.
I can only come on this show to learn new words like patina. I mean, that's the way it goes.
And respectability.
All right. Here's our charming intro music. Hang on. Cheers, you gentle listener, that this is a high quality, high production value podcast. Very best farm to table, sustainably obtained geeky conversation to your ear holes. So Dan, you are doing a new miniseries at Marvel for a charming little character some folks might have heard of, a little under the radar, Groot. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
He's a tree.
I had heard that.
And with yes, Groot, obviously, member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, he is a tree. Marvel has asked me to do a Groot miniseries, which I've been delighted to do, presumably to tie into the spectacular new movie that is out at the moment. Yes, an opportunity to return to at least one of the members of the team that I wrote sort of 15 plus years ago. I couldn't pass that up, really, and it's been great. Or Groot. What can I say about it? I was given a sort of a wish list of things to contain my story within, and one of the things was they wanted to sort of set it back in the past. During, as it were, his childhood, I think probably to tie into certain themes of origins that are in Guardians 3. And that presented a few problems, but I've got around them in really, I hope, really interesting ways, and revealed a little bit about his background. It's not an origin story as such, but it's him as a sapling, and connecting him with other characters and strands from the Marvel universe that I think people will probably enjoy seeing very, very much indeed. Obviously, one of the things I couldn't do was connect him in this story to members of the Guardians who clearly he hadn't met until the Guardians came along. So it was quite a fun thing trying to find ways of giving it connectivity, and also putting a one or two sort of physically heroic characters in the story when Groot was very small and obviously not going to be able to do the sort of literally the heavy lifting himself. So there's a kind of retro 60s Star Trek vibe going on in there. There's the return of as it were, a flashback to a character who's long since departed the Marvel universe. It's a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, I was really chuffed to see you bringing back the old school Captain Marvel, who was a favorite of mine from the old days.
Yeah, Captain Marvel obviously is one of the very, 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 very few characters in the history of comics who has died and stayed dead, and that is great as far as I'm concerned, because his death was such an event that it should never be undone. In fact, I've actively gone out of my way not to undo it over the years, even though I love Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel stories, and there's a huge temptation to do that. But because this was set way back in the past, there was an opportunity to see him alive, and also in that early phase, the green and white costume, the sort of the original version when he was a member of Kree Star Force. And so that's we're sort of seeing his formative years, as it were, his initial outings as a member of that, sort of his dedication, sort of his nobility that will be so important to him later on. That was fun. That was a fun thing to be able to do, because the timelines just linked up nicely.
Excellent. And one of our regular commenters, Dr. Fizz, is weighing in saying, I'm not going to fanboy too hard. Just thank you, Mr. Abnett, for the awesome 40K stuff you put on paper.
Well, that's very, very nice to hear indeed. Thank you very much.
So people wanting to check out Groot literally everywhere right now. Any comic book retailer you go to, you can find issue 1 on Comixology. I think you can pre-order issue 2. So check it out. It's going to be a good time. It's a good supplementary reading to that little movie that is playing in a few art houses all across America right now.
It was particularly enjoyable to be able to look at a character out of context like that and play around with it. And I sense already the reception to it's been very, very positive. We've had some really good feedback. So yes, I hope people enjoy it very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
No, please continue. Will.
I was going to say, do you find a character like this is a challenge to write because he's got that expansive vocabulary that you really have to deal with? I mean, because it seems like when I was reading it, you have a lot of background text that kind of informs what's going on, but then it seems like for conversational stuff, you got the Kree Star Force that's kind of carrying things.
I tried to make it a feature rather than a bug of the story. Yes, in fact, it is my fault that he only says that. Really, that was a decision I took during the run on Guardians, which is the basis of the movies and everything. And it's explained that obviously he's not just saying that; it's just that you've got to be able to understand what he's saying. And because this is set a long way in the past, and people haven't really encountered his people before. In fact, his world is sort of relatively undiscovered. That poses an even bigger problem. So I decided, rather than trying to find ways to circumvent that, I didn't want it to be, as it were, a silent book where it was just things happening and we had to understand what was going on. I didn't want it to be too narrative heavy. So I obviously wanted to put speaking parts into the book so that people can have conversations with him, because you understand what he's saying when you hear what people are, how they're replying and how they're understanding him. But then I thought, well, let's go a stage further and actually have that language barrier being both a difficulty and a mechanism in the story. So communication is a theme of the story. Learning how to talk to him. There's a sequence in the first issue where Captain Marvel is trying to learn how to talk to them and sort of failing badly, much to their amusement. That sort of idea of learning to both learning to speak in a way that can be understood, or being brave enough to speak in a way that can be understood, is an important learning thing for Groot, but also the ability to hear, the ability to, as it were, really listen to what somebody's saying and realize you've understood them all along, which is another thing. So those are not points that I'm, hammering away at through in the course of the story, but translation devices, that kind of stuff, play an important part in the story.
I really like the fact that each of the different characters had their own mechanism for speaking. So like we had Groot, obviously, then Tweeg and Gleef.
yes, he's got two friends in this, which is I quite like that. And again, it shows a variety. There's a little bit more of that, as you might expect. There's a bit more of that to come as the story progresses in I hope quite an interesting way. So yes, there we go.
Excellent. Now, as Dr. Fizz alluded to, you've also done a fair amount of work in the 40K universe, and I think that's what Mr. Fox wanted to talk to you about. Richard, can I tag you in?
Sure. Hi, Dan. I'm a longtime reader. So the End and the Death, the very first of the last two books of the end of the Horus Heresy. It starts with, and I'm just going to geek out a little bit on just how you presented this chapter. It starts with Horus Lupercal having a flashback where he's talking, this is before the heresy, and he's talking to a remembrancer, and he's talking about how much he loves Sanguinius. And everyone's reading this going, yeah, well, okay.
Foreshadowing.
But he goes through the whole process of having this interview, and then at one point he just sort of pops out of it and realizes he wasn't happy. That was not a flashback. I thought it was a flashback when I was first reading it. No, his mind was lost in the warp, and then he kind of just got snapped back into the present. And I just had to stop and go, damn it, he's good. So, that kind of it's just how you're able to kind of lead the reader down a certain path, and the reader's like, yeah, this is definitely what's happening, and then no, and then also the character and the reader both kind of realize that they had the misconception at the exact same time. And was that just fortuitous? Were you just writing along like, oh, this could work, or did you have like a plan of how to do that?
First of all, thank you for liking that bit. The End of the Death has been literally and metaphorically the most massive thing I've ever written. It's taken 2 years. It is huge. Every Siege of Terror book has been a daunting prospect for the writer involved. I did the previous one, Saturnine, which was at the time was like, oh my god, I don't know how I can do more than this. And then they said, will you write the last one? And I thought, well, that's appropriate, seeing as I wrote the first one. That's great. Knowing that there was a huge weight of expectation, just because it's the ending, it's got to stick the landing, and also because of the amount of lore that I've got to cover in those and the scale and everything like that. I mean, Warhammer and Horus Heresy is bombastic and operatic anyway. So how do you crank that up to 11 or beyond. You know, I mean, there were so many logistical things going on in that. And one of the things I realized that one of the ways I could establish scale was to present loads of characters, and therefore do it in sort of short chapters where we're moving between them, so you get this mosaic effect of a bigger and bigger world. And I wanted one of them to be Horus because of the way the continuity has worked towards the Siege of Terror, the continuity that's 30 years old that we're basing everything we do on. Horus sort of doesn't play a very active role during the siege for months and months and months. He just comes in a major way at the end, and I wanted to reflect that. I thought we need screen time with him. We need to sort of see what he's thinking and doing more than almost anybody else, because this is his big moment. And we also, and I'm not going to give spoilers, but we also need to explain certain things that are going to be happening later in this book. In the course, and by book I mean the whole thing when you've got the volumes together. So what has been released so far is very much the first part of a larger thing rather than the first part of a trilogy. Structurally speaking, there is plot architecture there that the sort of symmetries of which are not really apparent until you've got the next part. Anyway, so I wanted to do that. So skipping between these short chapters, I was playing with different points of view. I put it in the present tense to make the whole book very much more immediate, which is a pain in the arse in itself, but also put it in the present tense because I wanted that sense of time collapsing, that everything is happening right now and we're there with it. Horus is the one person who he has a sort of second person narrative. So everything it's kind of like we're in his head, but it's somebody saying you're doing this, you're doing that, which is, I feel like, one of those slightly distorting lenses. There's an uneasy dreamlike state to it. It's like, what's really going on? It's like, is this really happening? Once I was in there, that sequence of dislocation and sort of false memory and being displaced, mentally displaced, was a very important factor, and actually will have a bigger payoff later on. There are reasons for that you'll see later. But I wanted to show people where he was coming from, and also show him where he was coming from, so that we can make that contrast. It was almost like that, and several other bits in the book are reminders of where we were back in Horus Rising. So we feel it again, and we can see it again, and go, "Oh gosh, that's where it is." There is. I wanted us to see that change, and who better to reflect that change than him himself? So yes, it was a trick I was deliberately trying to do. Exactly how it's pulled off, that was just on the page. I mean, I thought I'm going to write essentially a flashback where we think we're in one place and then we're going to come out of it and move into the other. And it just happened. And I think it happens in a kind of very fluid, uneasy way, that it suddenly happened and you realize afterwards what it's done. I can't explain how that happened. I'm glad you liked it. It is one of those moments. Obviously, the chapter previous to that, the main chapter previous to that is is Malkador doing a similar thing about the Emperor. We're not going to put the Emperor front and center because he is essentially unknowable. But those were sort of balancing things. You get to the Malkador talking about the Emperor and how the Emperor's thought about things, about as close as you're going to get. And I thought, right, okay, with Horus, we can actually go to Horus. So you get the two sides. But then also have that sort of unreliable narrator thing, where even Horus isn't quite sure of literally what day it is and what he's supposed to be doing. And that is the thing that plays out there. So quite often, like I said, most of it's third person present tense. There is Malkador's first person, Horus's second person, and a couple of other sneaky things I do with the individual styles of different chapters, where I deliberately muck around with the vantage point and therefore the way it's written, and also shift vocabulary. So depending on which strand of the book I'm in, for instance, when we go to the Dark Angels defending the Astronomicon, I deliberately lose all the contractions, and I deliberately play up on sort of an older vocabulary, more archaic vocabulary, to make it feel like chivalric knights, Excalibur, the Round Table, that kind of stuff, which suits the Dark Angels. When I shift to, say, John Grammaticus and the Long Companions, who are sort of the most modern of the characters in the book, they're the most like us. Everything's contractions. It's kind of a more modern type of dialogue, so that you get these. So not only are there lots and lots of pieces in the book, this mosaic adding together, but each of those pieces has got a very different. So more like M&Ms than no, don't go there. But do you know what I mean? Each bit's got its own little flavor, distinctive flavor. Oh, this is flavored like that. This is flavored like that. So that was the sort of intent. I am glad that bit pleased you, and I'm sorry that my explanation for it was far too long.
but speaking of structure, there's a part where the companions are looking around in a library, and I won't go into deep, but they find something that directly leaks to something that was in Pariah.
Yes.
And I saw that and I was going, where is this? Hold on. Going, where is this going? And I'm just curious, like, okay, what's going to come out next? The final Horus Heresy book or the final book of Beckwin's trilogy?
The end and the death will be published by the time we return to Beckwin, just for the sake of common sense and sanity. There are lots of things like that. There are some that are what might be deliberately called Easter eggs, because it's such a pivotal moment in the entire universe. The idea that there's nothing forced about the fact that you can sort of touch on almost anything, because everything comes back to this moment, this conflict. It's sort of intergalactic in scale. It's certainly the whole solar system. It's the pivotal point in the history of mankind. So there's loads of touches with that many characters. You can reach out and just make reference to sorts of things, and people go, oh, that's interesting, or intrigued by it. But some of them are, I've done a sort of annotated version of the first Eisenhorn book, Xenos, which came out last year, I think, where I basically went through and sort of put footnotes in about how it had come to be, which was a weird exercise, but apparently people have really liked because the book's done very, very well. I hope at some point they'll let me do that for the end of the death, because I think there's even more there than people realize, because almost every sentence I was writing going, oh, that's an echo, oh, there's a link there, or I don't want to belabor it. Some are very obvious because they're kind of like classic refrains of Warhammer. Some of them are sort of buried references and sidelong things, but they're all there. They're sort of that you can go back over it and go, oh, I didn't notice that at all. So yeah, I don't expect anybody to get them all. But it's lovely when people get them, and when they get them and they're pleased because they've seen that connection there or whatever. I think it's very nice. There was just the most ridiculous amount of research went into it, because I didn't want to get anything wrong. I didn't want, but there was going to be so much scrutiny. I didn't want people to go, oh, he's forgotten that, or he did that, or oh, that's not right because of that. So they are very deliberate choices. In some instances, the continuity of the Horus Heresy is, like any great myth or legend, is kind of contradictory, because there are different versions of it, because it has evolved over the years, and we know that it's a sort of handed down legend in the universe. So I like the idea. Well, there was this intriguing idea that when it came down to it, I had to choose which version I was going to actually show and say, this is the truth, even though the legend then says something different, or this is the unexpected reality that led to the legend that people 10,000 years later are talking about. And that goes to the Horus, to the Emperor, certainly to Sanguinius, and some of the other big events that all happen. And just getting those events, those big events, in the right order, because it's previously been color text. Trying to make that into a novel where one thing leads to another and we understand what's going on, that was quite a challenge too. So I have to say it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It's the biggest thing I've ever done. Despite all those things, and the fact that I sort of staggered from the end of it feeling shell-shocked, it was also the most satisfying thing I've ever worked on. And when I finally finished it, I went, oh, it's over. I've got to, so I think that's a very, I think that's always a very good sign, because usually when I finish, it doesn't matter how happy I am with a book, when I finish it and I send it off to the editor, I go, thank God, that is a burden lifted. I've got that. I'm proud of it, but I've had enough by that stage, and I'm glad that I finished it and delivered it and it's complete, and I can free my mind to think about something else. With this, there was a yearning almost as soon as I wrote the last few words that there was no more of this story to tell, which is I think quite when the author doesn't want to leave the storyline. I think that's quite an encouraging sign for the reader.
Well, I really have to congratulate and thank you and the entire Black Library staff, because the Horus Heresy has been exceptionally well done all the way through.
Thank you.
It's amazing is how it's a prequel, and I normally don't like prequels because prequels tend not to have any kind of inherent tension to them, because you know how it ends.
Yeah.
However, with the way you and Black Library started the whole thing with, I was there the day Horus slew the Emperor, and I apologize for not saying that correctly. And then I read that, and I'm like, I'm here for the whole time.
It was
one line, like, I'm in.
I think the thing is that the Horus Heresy has been, you know, it's been a core part of the background lore since the game was invented, essentially, and it's something that we do think we know because there have been clear pieces of brilliant color text over the years in some of the rule books explaining what happened. Some quite extensive pieces. And it's a story we feel we all know because every single chapter, every single Primarch relates back to that moment, etc., etc., etc. So when they suggested it, I think you've got to understand the sort of naivety, our naivety, back when they said, do you know what, maybe Black Library is doing pretty well. They write some pretty good novels. Maybe we should let them have a go at writing the Horus Heresy in novel form. And we thought, oh gosh, that could be as many as 12 novels, you know. And also the naivety of us creatively coming together and going, as a comic book writer, I'm used to working as part of a team because it is a team sport. I'm used to collaborating with the artist and the letterer and everything else like that. But novelists, as I'm sure you know, are solitary and dangerous individuals who should not be let out in public society. The idea that you could get sort of 6 or 7 of them round a table and they wouldn't just fight was something we didn't know. The fact that we created this sort of writer's room that has essentially lasted ever since. It lasted all the way through the Horus Heresy and through the Siege of Terror. The membership has changed over the years, but essentially it has retained that. And the kind of democratic enthusiasm with which we've shared and brainstormed ideas. Quite often we've ended up not writing the good idea that was our good idea. Somebody else has done that and we've done something else. You know, it's come back. So there was a sort of generosity of spirit because we all wanted it to work really well. But even when the first book came out and the first books were coming out, we didn't know it was going to work. We didn't know it was going to be any kind of success. We hoped people would be interested in reading it. The fact that it was this huge thing and then allowed us to sort of spend more time expanding, showing the backgrounds of legions, really doing some expansive work on the background. I think that's probably where we kind of got around that everybody knows how it's going to end factor, because they didn't realize there was going to be so much detail, so much more to it as we went along. And also in some of the big moments, we found a different way of showing it. So it's not like we've changed the continuity, but we've maybe put a new wrinkle on it or shown something else that was happening at the same time that we didn't realize that throws it into a new light, that sort of thing. There's a huge amount of thinking gone into that. It's been an extraordinary ride. It's obviously it's ended up being much bigger than we ever thought it would be. And it is weird for me as being one of the sort of veterans from the first days to get to the end and realize we were actually sitting down to plan and execute novels that we had been thinking about so long ago and thought, oh yeah, we'll get there eventually. And here we actually were doing it. So that's a kind of weird feeling. And I hope we've done justice to the end. And that was my biggest concern, that we do justice, and the last book does justice to that kind of investment of enthusiasm, because there are, let's face it, too many examples in the world of things that have been great and then have not ended well, and there is a sort of taint that then runs backwards through the things that you've enjoyed, and you feel you can't enjoy them quite so much because you know it's going to end badly. And I didn't want it to be that, which is why it got such a high degree of effort. Anyway.
Now, have you noticed any crossover, like because people really enjoy your writing on one thing, they will follow you to another? Like, for example, those who like your work on 40K, would they, for instance, cross over to Groot because they enjoy your writing?
Yes, I am delighted to say that does now happen. It didn't used to. When I started off, and we're going back a few years now, but when I started off my writing career, obviously I was a comic book writer to begin with. I wanted to write what did you call them, real books? I wanted to write real books as well, but it was a case of it was my job, so it's like I took the work that was there, and the work was there tended to be comic book work, because working on one comic bred work on another, and then it was actually Black Library gave me my first opportunity to write novels commercially, which was terrific. And along the line somewhere, I've also started being a game writer and writing games as well, which is a sort of less visible part of my job, which was a whole new thing. But I found in the early days, I would go to conventions, and my essentially readership, people who were coming to see me to get book signed, for instance, would be very specifically of one camp or another. So they'd be Marvel readers. I love your work on Marvel, and I love the stuff you do for 2000 AD, or your Warhammer work, or the Doctor Who stuff, or something like that. And there was very little crossover between those things. And sometimes I'd almost I find myself having to sort of act as a translator between one group and another because they liked my work, but they weren't aware. And in fact, on many occasions, I found people who were genuinely surprised that the Dan Abnett who writes for Marvel is the same Dan Abnett. They thought there were two different guys who happened to be called that. And that's a weird experience. And I part of me likes to think that actually nowadays, people know me for my work and go, oh, you also did that, and I'm a fan of this, but I'm also a fan of that, and the sort of they have that sort of much greater breadth of awareness and enthusiasm for that. I'd like to think that's because people have been following my career and they like my work, so therefore they'll go looking for it wherever it is. But I also think it's got much more to do with the sort of the way the zeitgeist has changed in the last, dare I say it, 20 years, where we've seen the kind of the triumph of should I call it the triumph of the genre? But the idea that the genre is now something where you don't have to be ashamed of liking science fiction or comics or horror or fantasy or whatever it is. Like, you can actually be very proud of that. You can be enthusiastic. You can share that enthusiasm, and therefore you can cross-pollinate the universes that you're enthusiastic about without any sense of having to be sort of demarcated as a particular fan. It's no longer you are a Doctor Who fan and nothing else, or you are a Marvel fan and nothing else, and you can't possibly like something else because you're not allowed to, because there's too much of that kind of stuff. I love that fact that the people will follow storylines, follow characters, but also follow creators that they like from one thing to another. I think if I'd stayed in any one particular lane, if I'd just written for Marvel or if I'd just written for Warhammer, I know I've written a lot for Warhammer, but you know what I mean? I think I myself would have gone, oh God, I'd love to do something else for a change. One of the reasons that I still have the energy and enthusiasm these days to write these things is because I get to travel between universes, as part of my day job, which keeps everything very, very fresh indeed. But yes, they do now know me for more than one thing, which is good. I am known as the prolific Dan Abnett, which sounds like a compliment, and I'm not so sure. But anyway,
well, here you're known as Dan Abnett, who also writes real books. So
much better. Yeah. I'll have that on my business card.
I mean, I followed you from what was I reading at the time? I can't remember what it is at the time, but I remember thinking, because I wasn't really a DC Comics fan. And you went and started writing Aquaman, and I'm like, oh, let me give it an issue. And I'm like, okay, this was kind of cool. I'll give it another issue. And then, I would go into the shop, and they're like, hey man, you need this, and they'd slide over, another one of your issues, and I'd be like, yeah, man, just slide it into the bag. It's fine. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Thank you. When I started out in my career, obviously my very first sort of professional job was on staff at Marvel's UK office, and the only things we produced, I say the only things like it's bad, what the company did in London was to produce comics for nursery and junior age groups. So we were working on things like Thomas the Tank Engine and Mr. Men and Ghostbusters and Thundercats and Transformers, and we were producing these things weekly for the newsstands in the UK, which meant that the being an editor and indeed as a freelance writer on some of those things, one of the things that you needed to do very quickly was to learn how to understand a license, deconstruct it, and create stories for it that would keep the licensors happy. That is to say, you weren't going to break things. You would tell a story that could be told within that, and it wouldn't have to go back and forth for approval. You could keep, So I think a skill I learned very, very early on was that idea of looking at something and going, what's the interesting story what can I do? What's the biggest thing I can do within the limits of that? So that's why I've always been very, very pleased when, say DC comes along and say, Aquaman, would you like to write Aquaman? And I'm thinking, well, I know who Aquaman is. I've read some stories. I don't know what I can do, but let me have a look at it and see what I think I can do within that very particular space in the DC universe. What's the, and that is that's a challenge I either have always loved and I didn't know it, or I have taught myself to love and become good at. And it's kind of that challenge accepted moment where somebody comes along and go, well, I never thought of writing that. What can I do with that? It's a pleasure to do it.
Put it on the back of your business card. Don't threaten me with a good time.
That's been there for years.
That's awesome.
You know, I've got all these questions. I'm curious about what it's like working for the Thomas the Tank Engine franchise. But I promised you this would be a 30-minute podcast, and we are at 29 minutes and 54 seconds, so we should probably wrap things up. Our guest host, Mr. Fox, did you have any final thoughts or last-minute questions for Dan?
Mr. Abnett, I have a model here.
Ah,
And it's not very well painted. It's the second model I painted in 15 years. But
that is fantastic.
It's Eisenhorn.
It is Eisenhorn. Yes, I can see from here. That's fantastic.
And I was wondering if you would be so kind as to bless it with good dice rolls.
Absolutely, but by the spirit invested in me by Pontius Glora and all the powers of chaos, I therefore bless it for good playing and much success in your tournament.
Right. No excuses.
That's the first time we've had a religious ceremony in the podcast, but
Yeah,
I have to say I enjoyed it. All right, Dan, it's always a pleasure. Unfortunately, I have to get back to my soul-crushing day job on this laptop over here. Richard Fox, pleasure having you on again, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Walt, always a pleasure having you on. To
Thank
all our
you.
listeners and viewers, thanks for checking out the Banff podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.